Good morning and good afternoon. Creativity is all my life. I'm doing this job for the last 40 years, and as an amateur for 20 years. And when I was 40, I went through what's called the midlife crisis, but probably you don't know what it is. So it's when you ask yourself, okay, what about the second half time? And then I decided to turn my passion into a job, and that's how I'm here today. So it was a good decision. So I run probably maybe 1,500 brainstorms on this. And today I have like not strange, but some observation. And probably one is particularly striking, is this one. If you take this expression, creative thinking, in the end, the key word is not creative. I'm convinced the key word is thinking. Creativity is like not a byproduct, but it's a subset of something much more sophisticated, which is called thinking. So my 15 minutes before handing over to Alan, my 15 minutes is not about creativity. It's about thinking. And I'm convinced that if thinking process is better understood, it's full profit for any kind of creative session. So what is to think? What is to think? And let's start with this observation. If a father or a mother tells somebody, I'm thinking about my children, this is true. If the CEO of a bank tells a journalist, I'm thinking about my clients, this is not true. Because it's impossible. Probably you're in the same situation. If somebody at Google says, I'm thinking about the users, it's not true. At least it's not true the same way as for a father or a mother. When you think about your user, because of course you do, what do you do? You?
Generalize.
Generalize. I prefer another word, you simplify. There is no other choice. The CEO of a bank, if he wants to think about the market, he has to segment the market. It's 7, 8, 9 segments. And generalization and simplification are more or less synonymous. And this is a good start for today. If you want to think about anything, you have to simplify this particular thing into categories, segments, clusters, boxes, because of course there's a lot about boxes now, and it's probably the key word of the whole process to remember that at any time when we think, we simplify. I'm going to use this for maybe 4 words and 2 arrows. In front of you, you have the world. The world, okay, the world is moving, uncertain, diverse, complex, and partly hidden. What do you see about the world? Okay. You are here, and you want to think about the world. And you made the point. In your mind, you only have simplification. So I put here simplification. Simplifications. Most of the time, when we tell about a situation, this is simple. We should say it's simplified, because nothing is simple. And if you take, for example, a rainbow, you have the rainbow with 1 million colors, in your mind, 7 colors. You have 1 million clients, in your mind, 8, 7, 4 categories, etc., etc. We have simplifications. So if you take the metaphor, thinking is to play, and I like this metaphor. This is the playground. That's where it happens. And of course, a game has rules. And the rules of thinking are not that sophisticated. It happens here. So you immediately realize it goes in both directions. And I'm going to simplify, of course, with 2 arrows. One is here, and the other is here. Is here. When you think, either you are here or you are there. Let's take the CEO of the bank. He has a segmentation in 7 categories. He can call Ogilvy and other advertising, say, okay, I have 7 segments, you should talk to those people differently, etc. Is here. The starting point is a simplification, 7 boxes. And then he works a lot. Oh, go, yeah, we don't think that, etc., etc. But he's definitely here. To me, this arrow is more important. And those 2 arrows correspond to keywords in philosophy. This is, I just put deduction, and this is induction. Induction. And of course, completely different. Deduction is when you move from the ID, the simplification. An ID is a simplification. When you move from the ID to the world, you deduce. You want to go on vacation in Belgium, it's a simplification. You can call and say, check the cheap airline, etc., etc. So this is deduction. I'm convinced one day this is going to be completely on computers. I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be like that. Today you have still some problem, but okay, this is not the challenge. The real challenge is here. How do we simplify the world? How do we simplify? Because this is a world and you are the king of the algorithm. Of course, you don't have algorithm here. You have what we call heuristics. It's a way to find. But what's a heuristic? Yeah. If you lose your key, how do you find your key back? With a heuristic. Yesterday I was, this is heuristic. Finally you got a key. But it's not an algorithm. There is no certainty. So this is algorithm, this is heuristic. And next step is to realize that deduction can be perfect. Can be perfect. You do it twice, you have twice the same result. Induction cannot be perfect. Why? Because a perfect induction would require an infinity amount of time. Because you have to embrace the whole world, the whole world. And this is of course not possible. Because first, most of the world is hidden. Sometimes you are in contact with the reality of the world. When you interview somebody, for example, there is nothing between the person and yourself. At the end of the 30 minutes, you have a simplification in your mind. This person is good, not good, well, the simplification. But this is, in the end, maybe the exception. Most of the time, what do you have here? Simplifications of other people. If you have a report, a newspaper, any kind of book, they are all someone else's simplification. So even word, etc. So the induction cannot be perfect because it's not rational to be 100% rational, which is a bit striking. If you want to buy your next vacation, and then you say, okay, I'm going to go the next vacation with a full 100% rational procedure. You never go on vacation. Because you need to embrace the whole, what's the market? All possibilities. One day you say, okay, I go to Belgium. No. And then you need to, yeah, just an example. So, and it means that when you induce at a given time, you have to give up rationality. There is no perfect way to guarantee the simplification is the best one. On this side, you only have hypothesis. A segmentation is an hypothesis. Other segmentation do exist. And there is no algorithm to show this one is, of course, you can make some try and error, but you can never achieve certainty. So let's make a little exercise around this. I'll have 2 little sentences. And now I will not finish the sentence, and I will ask you to finish rapidly. Okay? Ready? Sentence number 1. An example of a car is? Huh?
A Nissan.
A Nissan. Oh. Parfait. Second. Yeah, because Nissan is Renault, and Renault is France. That's right. Okay, so this is one. Second sentence. The car is an example of? Vehicle. Transportation. The car is an example of? Engineering. Genius of The car is an example of a big problem in the near future. The car is an example of something I'd like to draw. The car, etc. You have understood the whole thing. Look what happened. First sentence. An example of a car is a Nissan. It took a millisecond. Not a big deal. So could say Renault, Ferrari, Mercedes, Audi. What happens? Your starting point is the simplification in your mind. What is a car? And you go down to the world. And you have Renault and Nissan, etc. Not a big deal. Bon, no discussion, no room for... Bon. Look at the other sentence. The car is an example of what came first? Vehicle. Okay, fine. This is called comfort zone. Because it's a no-risk answer. It's the souvenir of an old deduction. An example of vehicle is a car an example of vehicle. Okay, so no discussion, no risk, no danger, nothing. But if you realize that the second sentence can receive a lot of different answers. So I gave some room. So then it's a transportation, then you say engineering, say engineer, and you say the car is an example of a word of 3 letters, and etc., etc. So I summarize. It means that here we should remember at any time there is a lot of freedom here. In this arrow, you don't have room for creativity. You're down. The example of car is Nissan. Okay, good. You can improve the Nissan, but it's the real creativity happens here. When you remember that this can be organized in a completely different way. Just an example, and then I hand over to Alan. With the cafeteria. Imagine. Let's look, I'm going to simplify the story of Starbucks. Very simplified. I don't know those people, never worked there, so just the way I see it. The first idea, that's okay, I'm going to make good coffee and sell it everywhere. The idea is the coffee, and then you go down. And then you have Starbucks, and so, and you have different coffee with a lot of... Okay. But you're stuck in the coffee. What could happen with Starbucks? Imagine you ask people, could you please see your business without using the word coffee? So, no, everywhere coffee. No. Describe your business without using the word coffee. One answer could be, we have the largest office in the world. If you add all Starbucks, probably you have like the largest office. So it means that you take the word of Starbucks and suddenly you move from the idea coffee, which is here, you move to the idea of office, like this. And then you can have, if you think my business is not about coffee, I'm an office. I rent square meters of square feet. So I compete with others. You can have completely different idea, not the cappuccino with the no. You can say, okay, I'm going to put a printer, or you see it like this. And I read recently that in St. Petersburg and Moscow, there is a kind of new concept of cafeteria. Everything is free, but the time. Probably you're aware, and probably now it comes. But this kind of idea never comes if you have in your mind one box called coffee, because it's not possible. And so it's all about the freedom you have to look at the world in front of you, your market, your competitor, etc., and to build other simplification. Coffee is a simplification, office is a simplification, but the beauty is to do this. Voila. I hand over to Alan for more. This was used in the last century, so I feel better with this kind of...
That's good. We're going to keep referring to it, but I'm going to put it here because in this century we also have this. So, Luc gave you a beautiful model, a beautiful box. I could put box here as another synonym for how thinking works. And creativity is what we're going to come to now. Creativity is essentially this process here, the idea of the idea of all of this arrow, all of everything that happens here, this is the invitation to be creative. It's giving you the invitation to not just say that a car is a vehicle or a mode of transportation, which is of course not wrong, but to actually go beyond that and to say a car is something you like to draw or something you like to ride in with your second cousins on your way to a baseball game or whatever you want. Anything. You have the invitation to go as far as you want. And if box is another word for what comes here, then this is an interesting thing, because for 50 years we have been told, think outside the box. You know, just go in a room, take a plate of cookies, gather a bunch of people, think outside the box, solve all your problems. And yet, when I ask executives, whatever the industry or wherever around the world, you know, have you had a creative session lately? Have you had a brainstorm? Everybody says yes, 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 yes. But are you really happy with the results? Are you satisfied with it? People tend to say, no, it was a little bit frustrating, we didn't get exactly where we wanted to get to, etc. And one of the reasons for that is that thinking outside the box is simply not sufficient. No matter what we do, we're going to use a lot of boxes. We have a lot of boxes that process and help us interpret the world in front of us. Everything we do is governed by boxes. It's unavoidable. So thinking outside the box, to stick with the cars, is like telling you, don't drive on the highway. But it's not telling you if you should take the side roads or take a helicopter or use a video conference or something else instead. So think outside the box gives you absolutely no direction for where to find the new one. And that, of course, is the point of thinking in new boxes and the book that is available at the back. And so what I'd like to do is really take you through this 5-step process for thinking in new boxes that is outlined in the book. I will do so very quickly. And I will do so without using classic consultant BCG type slides like this one, starting after this one. So the first step is doubt. The first step is doubt. And what do I really mean by doubt? The whole point of doubt is to actually start by identifying some of your current boxes and challenge them. And that is a step that so many people often miss. If somebody walks straight into a room and says, we need new ideas, think outside the box, then they're jumping straight to this idea of divergence, getting a lot of ideas on the table, and that's fine. I have no problem with the traditional brainstorm. It's just that you can't start there. You have to prepare, you have to be ready, and you have to start with doubt. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. In fact, I'll give you an example, forget the slides, from 2 days ago. Luc and I, celebrating our launch, 8 o'clock in the morning, we needed to go for a coffee. Not Starbucks in this case, actually. We went across the street to another coffee shop that was right there. And at the register, instead of a tip jar, there were actually 2 tip jars. And in between the 2 tip jars, there was a piece of paper that said, which TV family do you prefer? The Huxtables from The Cosby Show, or the Tanners from Full House? And there was an arrow pointing to each tip jar. Okay? Now, I thought to myself, this is fantastic. This is a new box. This is a complete reconception of what the tip jar can be. Because people who probably feel very strongly about it would be more inclined to leave a tip in one of the 2 jars based on that, right? And you could tell, actually, perhaps it will or won't surprise you, I don't know, but the Huxtables jar was much fuller. Okay, so I thought, how interesting. May I please take a picture? I took a picture, I tweeted it, I went and sat down. Okay, fun. Then I actually went back there and started talking to the ladies behind the register and asking some more questions because being a consultant, I wanted to learn more about the actual data. And it turns out, okay, they change the question every day. And most importantly, the amount of their tips went up by 50% since they did this. Right? So the idea of taking your mental box of what is a tip jar, they could have gone their whole lives without actually changing that. You can go through life with saying a tip jar is a tip jar, you put it there. But they had a completely new box, a new hypothesis, a new idea for what the tip jar could be, and it had dramatic impact on their particular world. Now, this is not necessarily the invention of penicillin or the iPhone or whatever you want, right? But it is a game-changing thing. It fundamentally changed their particular world, and whatever the problem is that you're facing, the best way to get at it is to challenge some of your existing boxes. And the best way to challenge them, to doubt them, is to actually start by identifying some of them. And I want to show you a few cartoons that kind of explain why that is. Because if we accept that all of our boxes, all of our ideas are simply working hypotheses that we arrive at through induction, we have to challenge those because, to paraphrase Immanuel Kant, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. In other words, we each see the world through our own boxes, through our own lenses. And this is Immanuel Kant's favorite cartoon. And so, would have been. Here's another example, right? When we see something, whether it's an optical illusion, or whether it's an image, or whether it's calculations, or whether these perceived limitations, like when there's a new idea, oh, the boss will never go for that, we can't do that, our competitor tried that and it doesn't work. All of these things we have to doubt. We have to foster doubt. And I'll give you a quick visual example, even though this is true in really serious business situations as well. So, what is this? Well, you look at this and you say, well, this is George W. Bush upside down, and then you just go back to whatever you're doing, and that's fine. In a split second, your mind says this is George W. Bush upside down, and now, to save you the trouble of going like this, I flip it for you, and you see that somebody has actually photoshopped this thing, the mouth in particular, and the eyes as well. And they have, you know, cleverly, not cleverly, I mean, let's be clear, you can do this for the Queen or Obama or whoever you want, right? It's not a political statement, of course. But somebody has photoshopped this. But here's the interesting thing, right? If you go back and look at this again tomorrow, or even now, your mind immediately says, oh, it's George W. Bush upside down. And okay, now you're staring at it, you're starting to notice the mouth and the eyes. But immediately your mind jumps to these conclusions because the brain is lazy when it processes information. And when we go through this process of seeing something in the world in front of us and trying to find a box for it, we immediately go for the simplest solution. And 99.9% of the time, that's fantastic. It's usually helpful, it's usually correct, and it's an amazing benefit of being human that many companies, including Google, have tried to replicate. You know, think IBM trying to have a computer that plays chess or a computer that plays Jeopardy and all the stuff that you guys do. It's an amazing thing of trying to replicate what the human brain actually does just like that. But occasionally the human brain is misleading, and the more we allow ourselves to challenge our instincts, to doubt these boxes, and recognize that maybe this group that we've always thought of as our customers could be broader or narrower. And maybe the way that we've always looked at this particular segment or the strategy that we've always held might be open to reinvention. These are the kinds of things that we need to doubt. Another example, what's this? 12, 13, 14. This is what most of us would normally say. And if I were to show you this, you would very naturally say A, B, C. Nobody's going to say A13C or 12B14 on the other one. But again, there's often more than one correct way to interpret something. The context always matters. And you may think this is just a silly visual exercise. It's just as true in business. I give you an example. The annual report of, maybe not Google because you have some fun stuff, but the annual report of a typical Fortune 500 company, right? You open it, the first page is what? A letter from the CEO, right? Now, I am going to oversimplify, because that is what I do, and tell you that there are only two possible letters from the CEO that can appear there, basically. Number one, dear shareholders, the results this year have been excellent thanks to some fantastic strategic decisions that we made, blah, 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 blah. Number two, dear shareholders, the results this year have been quite disappointing because of volcanic ash, terrorism, recession, and all of the other stuff that's out of our control. We'll try and do better next time. Okay, so you're never going to have a letter with the exact same financial results inside that says, dear shareholders, we had fantastic results because we were really lucky, and we hope that holds. Or, dear shareholders, We had disappointing results this year because we screwed up a little bit and we did some stupid decisions, but we're going to really do better next year, we promise, trust us. You're not going to have that, but even if the numbers are exactly the same, if your customer research or trends about what's happening in the world are exactly the same, there are multiple ways to interpret it. So this is not just a 12, 13, 14 silly example, it's important and relevant in the business world. This is another example of the context being really important and how our minds jump to conclusions. This one might take a few seconds. Just wait. Okay, there's the, okay, good. So that's doubt. That's doubt. Always start by challenging some of your existing boxes, some of your existing perspectives, because once you do that, the rest is relatively straightforward. When I say explore, for example, this is the stuff that we generally know how to do. We can go and look at the 23 top megatrends impacting our space, or a massive customer survey of 2,000 people, or competitive intelligence, or network analysis, whatever it is. We generally know how to do that, but just be careful to always maintain the atmosphere of doubt. Just checking. Always be careful to keep this atmosphere of doubt alive and challenge the way you're looking at these things. Look at them with fresh lenses. That's the best advice for this explore phase. Okay, so once we doubt, once we explore, we have to think about the future. And in trying to think creatively about the future, there will always be surprises, like this. There will always be what are called wild cards or black swans. There's a lot of words for them. These high impact but low probability events that are very obvious in retrospect. And the reason these are so important, not just in this example, but volcanic ash or Gates giving all his money to developing world, stuff like that. The reason these are so important is because when we think about the future, we have a very natural tendency to do it based on the past. And there's a lot of very famous examples of this. The funnest one for today, of course, is Steve Ballmer saying, you know, in 2007, there's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. But there's hundreds of those quotes. Margaret Thatcher saying in 1969, I don't think there will be a woman prime minister in my lifetime. Any of these things. We are not good at predicting the future, and we are overconfident. All the more reason that when we explore, when we gather all of these facts about the world in front of us, we need to keep this feeling of doubt. So, once we do that, once we go through the process of identifying and challenging some of our existing mental models, then we can go into the creative process. And this is the stuff in terms of divergence, getting a lot of ideas on the table without judgment. Quantity is good, because whatever the criteria are that you've set for what is a good idea, there are going to be some that exceed the hurdle and some that don't. And so Linus Pauling, a double Nobel Prize winner, said the best way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas. And many people like Edison and others would certainly subscribe to that. Edison was a big believer in, you know, when somebody asked him, are you going to give up? You've been working on the light bulb for so long. He famously said something like, well, now I know 999 ways that it doesn't work. He didn't give up. And he had a whole pile of inventions as well. I won't go too much into that. But the main point, again, divergence, get a lot of ideas on the table. Convergence, select among them the prioritization. By the way, never try and do both of them at the same time. The most frustrating thing in any creative process is when some people in the room are just listing a lot of ideas and other people in the room are picking them apart one by one, and it's just thoroughly frustrating for both sides. You've probably been in both. So there's a time for divergence, there's a time for convergence. Remember that you will have no way of knowing a priori, no way of knowing up front, which are the more incremental ideas, like the two-bladed razor and the three-bladed razor and the four-bladed razor, or the iPhone 3, 4, 5, etc., and which are the truly transformational ideas, like the original iPhone and penicillin and the Model T Ford and all the rest of it. So you have to get it all on the table, and also you have no way of knowing a priori which are the good ones and which are the bad ones. So again, quantity first, divergence first. I put in here a few of my favorite type questions. I know that our time is a little bit limited and I want to leave time for Q&A. So I'm not going to dwell on these, just to say, you know, there is an infinite number of ways to ask fun questions in a creativity workshop. If you go in and just say, how can we be more creative? How can we grow? How can we cut costs? How can we need more ideas to double our size or whatever it is, you're not really likely to get interesting things. If you try and change perspective, make it more visual, reformulate the question in a fun way, then you are much, much more likely to get much more interesting results. If you are trying to cut costs in creative ways, then don't just say, what are some ideas? Say, how would executives at Ryanair do this? If you're trying to think about the customer experience in fun ways, how would executives at Disney do this? What would a joint venture with the New York Times possibly lead to? What sorts of things would I have thought of if I were on my first day out of college? Or what sorts of ideas would my grandmother think of? All these kinds of what-if type questions help push us outside of our existing boxes and help us find new ones. That's the point, and there's no shortage of ways to do that. So, the last step then is to reevaluate. And this kind of takes us back to doubt. This is about always remembering that no good idea is good forever. And that applies again to penicillin, the Model T Ford, and anything else. No good idea is good forever because the world keeps changing around us. And you can say maybe in some industries it might last for 5 years, and in other industries a good idea can last for 20 years. That's all fine. But one thing's for sure, in today's world, business cycles are getting shorter across all industries. The lifespan of a good idea is getting shorter and shorter almost everywhere. And this just makes creativity even more important than it ever has been before. So remember that no good idea is good forever. Henry Ford famously, no matter how amazing the Model T was, when General Motors and others started changing and coming up with higher-end cars and lower-end cars and all the rest, different colored cars, his famous quote, of course, was, "My customers can have any color car they want as long as it's black." He refused to change. He was a fantastically innovative guy, but he was still human. And all of us go through life with blinders on, wedded to our existing models. And so the more we can force ourselves to go back to doubt, to challenge that this Model T, which has sold 15 million units, and even today is one of the best-selling cars of all time, is going to be a good idea forever. Challenge those perspectives. One more example, just from the business world, is Reuters. Now, in the last few years, it was, of course, acquired by Thomson, but quite interestingly, its core box has stayed exactly the same for 160 years. Reuters, we think of their box as stock price delivery or news delivery, right? Now, they were founded in 1851 by Julius Reuter in what was then Prussia, now Germany. And their original overarching box, what is our mission, what is our goal? To deliver the news and stock prices. At the time, it was from Europe to the United Kingdom. How did they do it in 1851? They had a fleet of carrier pigeons to get the news and stock prices across the English Channel. And so the interesting thing about Reuters is that over the last 160 years, of course, they've had to reinvent themselves fundamentally. They moved eventually to the telegraph, and they piloted it, and they competed against others, and then they went to radio technology, and eventually, in the last few decades, to satellites, and the internet, and fiber optic, all the rest of it. In other words, in order to keep doing exactly the same thing, they had to fundamentally reinvent themselves no less than 5 times. And at any point in any of those transitions, they could have been beaten by a competitor, they could have, but the only reason they survived is because they were constantly willing to reevaluate, to doubt, to challenge the fact that the way things have been done so far will always work. No good idea is good forever. And we don't like it when we have to change our perspective. When someone forces us out of our existing box, like Henry Ford, we sometimes go into denial. We don't like to change. We have to allow ourselves to do so. We have to foster a culture where that sort of thing is encouraged. And at least when you look at the, I don't know what it's actually like to work here, but everybody's perception is that this is the type of culture where that sort of thing is in fact encouraged, where people are encouraged to challenge the status quo and think about things differently. That's the perception on surveys and in the media. You can tell me after whether it's true or not, but that's everybody's sense in the outside world. So, a quick poll, multiple choice question. Which of the following is absolutely essential for a successful brainstorm? A big plate of cookies, the latest technology, a fresh setting, a new perspective, coming up with new ideas, or none of the above? Who says A? Well, Okay, well, you have awesome food in the cafeterias here, but that's great. Who says B? Who says C? Okay, who says D? And who says E? Okay, so a lot of D's and E's, and maybe one person on A, B, C. And I will just tell you one last quick story then about why, for us at least, in this particular box, the answer is in fact E. And why it is possible to be very, very creative and have an amazing creative session without coming up with a single new idea. An example, Bic, the French pen company, founded after World War II by Marcel Bic. For 30 years, they made only pens, right? So imagine then it's the 70s, 30 years later, and you have the executive team thinking about how to grow. We need to grow. We need new ways to grow. And some of the executives, Holly will say, maybe we can make these 4-colored pens, right? And Henley might say, we need erasable pens. We could do erasable pens. And we could do refillable pens. And we could do branded pens that say Sheraton or Hilton on them or whatever you want. And then you suddenly say, we could do lighters or razors. The immediate reaction from your colleagues is bound to be, what a crazy idea. We're a pen company. We're a pen company. And yet, with 40 years of hindsight, we all now know that they made a lot of money off of lighters and razors. So, what happened? What had to happen? Each of the executives in the room had to change their box from we are a pen company to we are a disposable plastic consumer goods company, or some such thing. It doesn't roll off the tongue in the same way, but it's okay. We are a plastic goods company, right? And if that is your box, then lighters and razors are a perfectly logical idea. They're perfectly reasonable, and in fact, it did open the door to all sorts of things for them. Now, that doesn't mean that erasable pens and all the other ideas were bad ideas. They were just more incremental ideas, like the 2-bladed razor and the 3-bladed razor that came after. But the truly transformational ones require a change in box. But here's the most interesting thing. Gillette was already making cheap disposable plastic razors. The lighters existed too. In other words, they opened the door in a creative way to all sorts of new possibilities simply by changing one of their boxes on this side. Nothing changed on this side. They didn't actually invent something new. They were very creative without coming up with a single new idea. So that's the point. Creativity is about changing perspective. It's about changing your boxes. And it can be the box for how you look at your company, yourself, your customers, your competitors. It can help you with a midlife crisis or changing an organization design or whatever you want. It doesn't only have to be about new product development. Creativity is about changing perspective. And so that is a good way to end with one last visual thing. So we, using our quick heuristics, can immediately decide what this says, right? Whereas a computer, like Watson or any sort of artificial intelligence thing, would look at all the possible permutations in a deductive way of what this could say. We immediately look at that and say, well, it says be creative in a split second, right? And yet, we have to always doubt. Be creative, but always doubt. So that is the sort of lightning version of the 5 steps to thinking in new boxes. It's about philosophy and how we think, but it's also about practicality and how we can actually make this happen in the business world. So be creative, but always doubt. So thank you very much. We have a chunk of time for questions, I think.
I'm just wondering about the doubt part. Like, how do you figure out or apply that to sort of a complex problem, right? Do you start doubting everything? Do you start doubting every foundational idea that has come before it? Where do you where is it effective to doubt? Mm-hmm. Or what is it effective to doubt? Well, you're matching, so you can both.
Yeah, quite right.
You wore your matching outfits today.
Yesterday too, by coincidence.
We spent a lot of time together, I assume.
So probably the first thing to do is to give a good definition of what is to doubt. Mm-hmm. So to doubt is not a kind of bad feelings. It's about, remember at any time that here you only have simplifications. So that's to doubt. So, and I like to tell great managers, never hesitate and always doubt. So if you're a manager, and somebody asks you, the client doesn't pay, send a reminder. The machine is broken, call the company. You don't hesitate. But you should remember at any time that if it's possible for you not to hesitate, it is because one day you select one simplification, a strategy. You're going to do this. And doubt is on the other side. It's just a reminder, just we are built with simplification in your mind, assumption, and to doubt is from time to time to challenge those assumptions. So to answer your question, the first thing to do, I believe, is to list your assumption. And sometimes they are unconscious. We always said this. Why finally? Maybe we can do that a different way. So you know what I mean? Yeah.
Let me add to that and give a business example as well. Because I think this idea of identifying as many of your assumptions, and of course you can't change them all at the same time. That's when you would become a sort of a caricature of a good manager. You can't change everything. But imagine 40, 50 years ago, all of the airlines are the sort of traditional Pan Am British Airways type, and there's no such thing yet as a low-cost airline. So what are the very specific assumptions and constraints that have to change? Well, we have many types of planes to serve different definitions. We have one type of plane because it's cheaper. We go to the main airports in each city. We're going to go to secondary airports. We have assigned seating. We have open seating. We have all-inclusive pricing. We have unbundled pricing. We use travel agents. We don't use travel. All of these things, to be very specific about what your existing assumptions and boxes are, and then figure out which ones of them you're very deliberately going to change, which constraints you're going to break. That's what we mean by doubt. What else? Please.
So one of the challenges that comes to my mind is the constraint of velocity of execution, right? So we live in a world with this a lot of competitive pressures. We have to get things out. So this sounds great, but I'm wondering if you have any tips on making it more practical and sellable. And let's say we want to start doubting, or like the person is, the picture, like I'm just checking, or you have to give yourself time and space to allow for that exercise to happen. And often we don't.
Quite right.
Have you faced that in your discussions, and what has worked for you to encourage or get people to actually say, aha, we really need to take this on?
Yeah.
Part of the answer is called scenarios. So part of the future you can more or less expect and make some forecasts. But other part of the future, including the ash of the volcano, there is no way to make any kind of forecast. So we recommend to increase the preparation. And so if you take uncertainty on the right side of my flip, the other side is a simplification. It's called scenario. In this particular case, a set of scenarios. So there is a way to disseminate the language of uncertainty. We did that maybe 50 times in company. Just like have this habit to live with an uncertainty in your mind, like this. And scenario thinking is the best way to do that using this method.
So I agree with the idea of using scenarios to embrace uncertainty, because even if our natural tendency is to try and eliminate it, if we realize that we never can, then let's embrace it. But on a more individual level, in terms of how to foster doubt, how to set this up in organizations, my best suggestion is that sometimes these kinds of thought exercises, like describe your company without using the most obvious words, like coffee, like Luc tried earlier. There's a lot of these that can be done in 10 minutes. There's a lot of these that can be done by, shutting the laptop, taking a white piece of paper, or a flip chart, or a blank document, whatever you want, and just thinking a little bit. You don't need to take 8 hours and methodically list all of your assumptions, though over time that can't hurt. But to be very quick and specific about it, you can still make some progress. What else? Please.
apart from the tip jar example that you gave, what is one of the most interesting new boxes that you've kind of just seen without kind of like on the fly, I guess?
My answer would be Google. Because when you start, the simplification was, we're going to build a search engine. And so for a couple of years, that was the main vision, so we have to do this. But imagine that nobody would have changed that. Today, no Google anymore. It's because one day, you have this famous mail, let's manage the information of the world or something like that. That's one of the most beautiful examples I know. Otherwise, no Google in New York, definitely. And probably you can have more. But an example I very often give.
I saw a curved escalator a couple of days ago. 6th floor, down to the 5th floor, like this. This was just in terms of ones I see on the fly, right?
Yeah.
You know, not the, the BIC, the Google, all of these are fantastic examples, sure, but like the tip jar, something I was at the Bloomberg building, and a curved escalator was fantastic. And very expensive, by the way. I asked about that too afterward. Anyway. Please.
Another question, selfishly, I'm taking up the question. You had an interesting example of BIC and the pen, right, and how they redefine themselves from a pen company to a disposable plastics company. And I'm wondering, have you seen companies go through multiple iterations of this, right? So you redefine yourself once, right? Now, are they stuck with this new box and they don't know what to do? I mean, have you seen companies go through this multiple times? Give your example.
Reuters was a good example.
Reuters is a good one in the sense that even though they kept their big overarching box of "we are this," they changed fundamentally all of the underlying mechanics of how they did that. So that's a good example in some sense.
There are a lot of good examples. Danone. Danone used to be a glass company. It was not BSN, just glass manufacturing bottles. And one day they said, okay, we should focus on the content, not on this. And that's it.
And then, after decades of being a conglomerate like Nabisco or whatever, known for making food, quality food, they switched their box again. Instead of good food, they switched to food that's good for you. And they sold off their beer division, they sold off their cookies division, and now all of us know them as water and yogurt and baby food, I think. So now they focus on healthy food that's good. So again, these multiple switches do happen. It tends to not be year after year after year. But it's fun when it does. Please.
Reading about Pepsi and what happened where the CEO decided that they wanted to focus more on making healthier products, and he tried it for about a year, and then there was a lot of shareholder pushback, and they said, don't do it, and then he had to switch back. And I was asking, was that the wrong idea, or should he have done it in a way that worked?
Yeah, I give you another example along those lines as well, right? Because take Netflix, right? In many ways, a fantastic new box at first, changing, essentially killing the video store, video rental in a store business, and replacing it with a new box of DVD rental by mail. Okay, new box, 10 years, millions of subscribers, excellent. Then what happens? Just like in the example you said, they changed a little bit too early for their customers by trying to split into two with the streaming business as well as the mail, and there was a huge outcry. They lost hundreds of thousands of subscribers and shareholder value and all the rest. Very upsetting. They recovered, and now, who 2 years ago would have predicted that Netflix would have award-winning original television programming? I mean, this is an extraordinary new box and actually decent stuff. And so really, again, continuously reevaluating and rethinking some of these things. But you're right, the main takeaway from what you said is that there is a right moment for any change. And sometimes it'll be too early, sometimes it'll be too late. The most obvious example to me is YouTube, right? If somebody had invented that a few years earlier, there would never have been enough bandwidth Nobody had enough not enough people had high-speed internet in their homes, is what I'm trying to say, for it to be very successful. And of course, if they had invented it a few years later, someone else would have come up with something and it would be called something else, right? So it is a question of timing. You're quite right. And Netflix, YouTube, and the example you said are all good examples of that. It's about what is the right new box and when. Good. Well, thank you very much for having us here.
Thank you.
And we're available to stick around and talk more, sign books if anyone takes them, and really, it's lovely to be here.
Thank you so much.